Hi, and welcome to my overview of the Russo-Japanese War. This is the war that was happening in 1904, 1905, and obviously it's between the Russians and the Japanese. It's a key event that we're looking at in the lead up to the downfall of the Romanovs. Now, just to set it out to begin with, you don't need to know every little event that happens during the war. That's not the focus. Our focus is actually on why was there a war? Why did the Russians get involved? And what impact did it have on Russia and its government? And it's that impact that we'll really want to focus on, because it does have a huge impact and leads to other events which are going to start to trigger towards the end of the Romanovs. Now, as you are here, you can see these notes here on the right. This is the set of notes you should have in front of you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some pictures on screen, but I'm also going to be following through these notes as we go. So you may decide you want to add some little annotations to these notes as I'm talking through, okay? So we're looking at the notes now and just setting up our understanding of what Russia was like in 1904. This stuff you already know, so it's really just flicking through this. We know that Russia was really trying to modernize and industrialize, and it was making progress. You've been working on your essays. You know that progress was being made. But the same system of government exists. Nicholas II is the Tsar, and we are still an autocracy. The government has absolute power in the Tsar. And so while we're seeing changes, we haven't seen any in terms of how people are living. There's no change in terms of how decisions are made. We know that Russia is still facing serious economic and social problems. You can see this image at the top here, which is actually taken from a movie depiction of what it might have been like inside one of these disgusting factories in Russia. And of course, our peasants at the bottom. So poor living conditions, particularly in the urban environment, but also out in the countryside. They were suffering from drought. There was famine in the early 1890s. There were harsh conditions for farmers, and inflation, which is where it's starting to cost more to buy your basic things like bread. Inflation was affecting everybody in Russia. So things weren't good. Things were not going well. And the government, the Tsar, was having difficulties keeping control of the people. Now, also, we want to understand that Russia, like many countries in Europe at the time, had these large imperial ambitions to expand their power and access more resources. Now, we know that over on this side in the West, there wasn't much room to move because there's so many countries here in Europe. So Russia and the Tsar are eyeing off this side of Russia. How can we expand in the east? They want more natural resources, they want access to more labour, and they also want access to the Pacific Ocean. So by having more ports over on this side, they can then access that side of the world while still being at home. One of the things that they were building is the Trans-Siberian Railway, and while it's not shown on this map, you can get a sense that it would have been going across here, and it would have gone around the bottom of the lake, and then they wanted to get to this Russian town of Vladivostok. Okay, but as you can see here, who would want to build a railway all the way around when we could just cut across? That would be nice. And this is what the Russians did. They made a deal with China down here, made a deal with China to get access. So here we've got that town of Vladivostok again. So instead of building their railway around the edges, which was actually in Russia, they signed a 25-year lease with China to access this whole area of land, which was in the north of China, so that they could build their Trans-Siberian Railway straight across to Vladivostok and also have access to this very important area here called Port Arthur. Port Arthur was a very key port to be able to send your ships out into the Pacific Ocean out here. Now, the main ally that Russia had at this time was France. France and Russia had become allies back in 1892. We'll talk later in the year about exactly why these two started becoming such close friends. You can see a few different depictions here. Both of these are French depictions of the alliance between France and Russia, and it was renewed at different times. We can see here, though, a slightly ruder cartoon version of the Russian bear cuddling up with Mariana, who's a depiction of, she represents Republican France. And so France and Russia were close allies by the time we get into 1904. It's important to know who's friends with who as we go into a war situation. Let's now take a look at Japan. What was Japan like in 1904? Well, you've got to understand that Japan is territorially a very small country. You can see here, all this brown, remember, Russia, big place. Japan, however, is very small, so it has very limited access to natural resources and labour that it needs. And you have to understand, Japan is a hugely ambitious country at this time, at the beginning of the 20th century. It wants to modernise, it wants to industrialise, and it wants to be a world power. Now, one of the things that it had done is, you can see here this depiction from Japan of, itself as a modern industrial nation. For those of you interested in Japanese history, this is known as the Meiji period, the Meiji Restoration, to restore the greatness of Japan. And it really was a significant, it industrialized very quickly. We can see here in a war which Japan fought against China. Remember how big China is? Japan fought against China in what we call the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, and the Japanese won. So this tiny, small nation did actually defeat massive, large China. You can see in this British cartoon here. Now, the Japanese won this Sino-Japanese War, and it was a sign to the whole world that Japan was here, and Japan was the new force of Asia. Despite its small size, Japan was now the major power in Asia. Also, Japan basically had control of the whole of the Korean peninsula. This was the start of the Japanese Empire. And as we go further into the 20th century, we see Japan continuing to want to expand its power, its access to land and resources. Now, the main ally for Japan, remember, it wants to be a world power, so it's looking for European friends. Its European friend is England or Britain. We can see a depiction here. The alliance between Britain and Japan is signed in 1902. This is a Japanese depiction. They're looking after China and Korea here. I don't know how well they're actually looking after them, more that they're accessing their resources, but this is clearly a Japanese depiction of this new strong alliance between two small island nations, but both nations wanting to be world powers. So as we move into 1904, what we're seeing are tensions mounting in this part of the world over here in Asia between Japan and Russia. As I said, Russia wants to expand, Russia wants to grow. Japan wants to expand, wants to grow, and therefore they're really eyeing off here the same territory. In the end, it is Japan that starts the war. Japan attacks Port Arthur down here at the end of this peninsula which the Russians were leasing. So this was really a Russian port at the time. So the Japanese attack, and Nicholas II, in the end, is happy to go to war. You've got to understand the mentality of Europeans at the time. A war can bring great victory, can bring reputation and status to a country if they can win the war. And we've got to understand that Russia felt pretty confident. So this is a Russian cartoon. You can see here the Russian soldiers and the navy sitting behind their fences, all their guns, okay? And they are looking pretty happy, pretty content here. This one's smoking a pipe. He's feeling so content. Here's Japan over here with their allies Britain, ready to attack. The Americans are here just kind of watching to see what's going to happen. But the Russians are portraying themselves as quite, comfortable and confident that the Japanese will not be able to really affect them. Here's another Russian postcard from the time. Again, here's the Russian Russia sort of striding across, sending these Japanese fleeing because of their might and their power. What really happens, though, during the war? Well, we see battles fought on land and on sea, and both sides suffer heavy losses. We can see here some Japanese depictions of the war. So you can see this massive Russian battleship here, but it's being successfully bombed, attacked by the Russian gunships themselves. Look at how modern these ships are. This is 1904. Also, on land, we see battles being fought, certainly still using a lot of cavalry at this stage on the horses. But the Japanese here are winning, cutting down the Russian troops, and the Japanese are succeeding. The war only lasts for about 19 months, but it starts, while the Russians think at the beginning that it's all going to be fine, they certainly realise pretty quickly that they are under a lot of strain. Here is a British cartoon from 1905, early 1905. This is during the war. And you can see here the depiction of Nicholas II, the Tsar. And here's his Russian prestige running quickly out, very quickly. It's running through the sands of time are running out. And he is looking very troubled. And he needs to get out because this is actually badly affecting Russia's reputation. And we can see here, this is an American cartoon from 1905. This is the American President Roosevelt. He's offering to try to make peace between Russia here on the left and Japan here on the right. In the end, both sides suffer badly as a result of the war. But the way that the Japanese depict it is that they are the victors. They have been able to take on the massive giant of Russia and really give them a good go. And this is a big boost for Japanese self-confidence and prestige of the time. The new sense of national pride, unity in Japan that boosts ongoing Japanese expansion into the future. But in Russia, it is a disaster. It has a massive impact on the self-confidence, but in a downwards trajectory. The people of Russia feel humiliated being defeated by this small Asian nation. And so the Russo-Japanese War has this horrible, bad effect on Russia. A number of things start happening in 1905. Many more strikes, protests. The people have suffered because of the war. They're getting more hungry. They also had to try to ship food, and they had to send their sons off to war all the way across in Asia, on the Russian side of Asia. And so the Russian people are not happy with the outcomes of the Russo-Japanese War. And there are a number of events, some of them we'll come back to and take a look at in more detail, a number of events in 1905 that happened because of this discontent that's being felt by the Russian people. So we see in 1904, 1905, the organisation of many more strikes, people out on the streets actively protesting against the Tsar. The Tsar has made these bad decisions and has led them into this position where they feel embarrassed, as well as the fact that their own individual living conditions are suffering. They're hungry, they're tired, they really want to get out of this war. So what we've got to understand is that the Russo-Japanese War, the Tsar might have gone into it thinking, hey, here's a chance to enhance our reputation. But in fact, because of the fact that Russia can't hold their own very well against Japan, it actually contributes to a downward spike in trust in the government and increases the level of discontent amongst the people. So this sets us up. Think of that. If there's so much more discontent amongst the people, all of these political parties that are offering alternatives, they're starting to gain more and more support. And people are looking at the Tsar in a slightly different way. Maybe not as much trust in, the Tsar that was looking after them in the past. So the Russo-Japanese War really sets up a peak of discontent, which leads into the next events we're going to look at, which is Bloody Sunday, an event that happened in early 1905, and then the 1905 revolution itself. Happy reading.